There was once a knight in shining armour, handsome, noble, and strong. He dedicated himself to God and love. George and the lady, go! Wherever he went, he brought justice and mercy. Many a time he rescued a damsel in distress and jousted to win his lady's favour. Were there really knights like this in the Middle Ages? Or were the knights they remember here in the Italian town of Cesena more typical? One day in 1377, a troop of knights and armed men rode into the town, closed the gates, and set about killing every man, woman, and child. One report claimed that 5,000 unarmed civilians were slaughtered in one day. The knight in charge of this massacre was an Englishman. His name was Sir John Hawkwood. What on earth had happened to the golden age of chivalry? Our story of the knight begins in 1066, when William the Bastard conquered England. The Anglo-Saxons called his followers knights, which became knights. William, who now understandably changed his name to William the Conqueror, rewarded his knights with land and property. But they didn't pay rent. Instead, they had to provide military service for the king. The whole system was designed as a war machine, and the sort of knight who did well in it was not the quiet, retiring type.
The ability to beat another man to a bloody pulp or cut him to pieces was not merely a requirement of knighthood, it was one of its ideals. Richard the Lionheart, for example, was celebrated amongst the knightly classes for his habit of chopping his victims' skulls down to the teeth. But to everyone who wasn't a knight, this was a bit of a problem. How could you control these men? How could you channel their testosterone culture into something that was less destructive of society? The idea society came up with was to try and invent a code of behaviour by which the knightly class must learn to govern themselves. Well, it certainly seemed like a good idea. What made the Norman knights different was the fact they fought on horseback. And since the French for horse was cheval, a mounted warrior was known as a chevalier. And so the code of conduct for knights, indeed their whole culture, became known as chivalry.
But what exactly was chivalry? Well, it depended who you were. The knights themselves had no doubt what chivalry meant to them. It meant learning how to kill people, making money, and getting famous. And in the 12th century, the man who best embodied what the knights thought chivalry was Sir William Marshal. William was already hardened to the perils of battle by the ripe old age of 5. In 1152, William's father, John the Marshal, rebelled against King Stephen, and the king laid siege to John's castle. During the siege, his father handed William over as a hostage, and at one point, the king put the boy into a catapult and threatened to shoot him back over the castle walls. William's father shouted back that he didn't care about the child, since he had the hammer and the anvils to make more and better sons. William clearly knew what it was to have a caring, loving father. And just to make sure he got the point, when his father died, he didn't leave his son a penny. William was faced with two alternatives: join the church or become a knight. So William William went to Normandy, where his cousin ran a sort of military academy. Exactly what William might have learned there was demonstrated to me by Steve Mallet, a specialist in medieval horsemanship, and historian Tobias Capwell.
God, this looks frightening.
I think that's the idea.
But he trained them to realise that.
Absolutely, yes. There's manuscript evidence that actually shows horses being trained to kick, to strike out at a shield that's held by an attendant.
So the horse is a weapon.
The horse is the most powerful weapon that a knight has.
And what's the most crucial part of that training to the horse?
Well, a horse is a flight animal, and its natural reaction, which is perfectly sensible, is there is a threat, so you run away. But what Steve's doing here is teaching a horse to override its natural instinct. The training should bring the horse to a point where it's really an extension of the rider, that the horse's legs are moving as if they are the rider's own legs, and that when the rider asks for something, it happens instantly.
I bet there were times when William felt he wasn't getting anywhere. I mean, he was still broke, but at least he was learning to join the ruling class.
Right now, he's working to move the horse sideways. The ability to subtly change your line against an opponent is extremely important. You know, this is really about power steering.
It just stops just like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Power brakes as well, very important.
At the end of it all, William was dubbed a knight by the Earl of Tankerville. Now, at last, he was equipped to earn a bit of ready cash. And he didn't even need to go to war. There was plenty to be made on the tournament circuit.
In the early days, a tournament was a miniature war played for sport. The tournament field stretched over miles and could include villages and towns. It was a bit like the Isle of Man Grand Prix, only with knights chasing each other on horseback and hacking at everyone with swords. It was terribly popular.
The money-making came when you captured another knight and held him for ransom.
William hit the jackpot with his first tournament. His biographer tells us, only that morning the Marshal had been a poor man as regards possessions and horses, but now he had 4.5 fine mounts. I'm not quite sure what he did with the half a horse. Maybe he ate it.
Sir William didn't just get rich, he achieved that other aim of chivalry, fame. While he was still in training, he caught the eye of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Well, a lot of young knights did. But then he served her husband Henry II with great success.
In return for his loyal service, Henry rewarded William with the hand of the most eligible heiress on the market. She came complete with oodles of land and her own castle.
And this is it, Chepstow.
Well, the landless William had finally become a man of property. It was every knight's dream come true. He was famous as a warrior and one of the richest men in England.
When he was buried at Temple Church in London in 1219, the Archbishop of Canterbury called William Marshal the best knight in the world.
Fame, wealth, and God's approval. It's what chivalry was all about, if you were a knight.
Oh, and sex. Knights used chivalry to legitimize doing the things they liked doing.
Violence was intrinsic to the cult of chivalry. Even, you may be surprised to learn, violence to women. According to the great chivalric writer Chrétien de Troyes, if a knight found a damsel alone, he would sooner think of cutting his own throat than of offering her dishonour. But on the other hand, if the damsel were accompanied by another knight, and if it pleased him to give combat to that knight and win the lady by arms, then he might do his will with her just as he pleased, and no shame or blame whatsoever would attach to him. Well, isn't chivalry just full of little surprises?
So, for the knights, chivalry meant fighting, fame, and fortune. But there were others who wanted to harness the power of chivalry in their own interests.
The church, which was itself often the victim of the knights' violence, had the bright idea of diverting their energies.
In 1095, Pope Urban II reversed centuries of Christian doctrine by announcing that it was now fine for violent young men to butcher people, so long as the victims weren't Christian. From all over Europe, knights flocked to the cause. At the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, they boasted of wading in infidel blood up to their knees. Hitherto, knights would have had to do penance for killing, but now the killing was the penance. In 1276, the Catalan knight-turned-hermit Raymond Lull thought he'd better lay down some ethical guidelines.
Lull said that the proper chivalric knight's first duty was to defend the Christian faith, then his lord, and then women, widows, and orphans. For Lull, even the knight's equipment was full of religious significance.
The mail coat protected him like a castle against vice. The helmet was a symbol of the knight's fear of shame. The sword reminded him of Christ on the cross. The shield signified how he should defend his lord, and the spear stood for truth and strength. There was a third power in the land with an interest in controlling the violence of the knights. This was their earthly lord, the king. To keep knights on side, the king was happy to offer glamour, pageantry, and all the fun of dressing up. What's more, in royal employment, knights could become part of the fantasy world they enjoyed in their stories.
Edward III, for example, revived the glorious, though entirely fictitious, traditions of King Arthur. Windsor Castle was to be his new Camelot, and he planned to set up a round table of no less than 300 knights. He must have realised he was heading for a catering disaster with 300 knights round one table, so he went for something more exclusive. He created 2 tournament teams, each of 13 star knights, and these were to be the 26 members of the Order of the Garter. And this is the Order's home, St George's Chapel, Windsor.
Even today, to be a Knight of the Garter is about as exclusive as it gets. And as a perk, you get free storage for your crest and banner here in the chapel.
These are today's Garter Knights. You can still see them arranged on either side of the chapel in 2 teams, just as they would have been in Edward's day. You see up there, there's Sir Edmund Hillary, the conqueror of Everest, with a kiwi and an ice pick. And that banner is Sir Edward Heath, with a morning cloud. That was the name for his yacht. And over at the end there is the Baroness Thatcher, and she's the only one without a sword. They're probably going to give her a battle axe.
But why did medieval knights feel they needed to stick swans and trees on their helmets? Why, indeed, have banners?
The thing is, now